And once again, Dan, it's an honor to have you here. And let's make sure we never forget John Menke and the fact that he gave his life for this country. He is a true hero that should never be forgotten. And now, Dr. Michael Israel will come up and he will give us a speech on the history and importance of the Second Amendment. Dr. Israel.
For those of you that have been to these before, this was actually supposed to be the first time we had one of these. I wasn't going to be speaking, and unfortunately Mike Sodrell's wife's not doing well, and he was supposed to be here and he couldn't, so I am the reserve fill-in guy. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. The Second Amendment, you know, what's it really about? Well, I mean, the first thing is what is it? I don't know if any of you can recite it off the top of your head. Let me just read it to you quickly. It takes a long time. It's going to be like, you know, really, really long here. Sometimes brevity is important. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, that comma is important, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, there's a whole lot of questions about what those words mean and how which ones go together which way. And an interesting thing, as I was doing a little research into this, was I found out that many of you may not realize this. How many people realize that actually there are 3 officially unofficial versions of this? Having the punctuation slightly different and capitalization slightly different, with state being capitalized in one version and not in another, and militia being capitalized in one version and not another. And that's one of those things the lawyers love to get into the discussion of, does that mean it's different? And the House apparently passed the one version, the Senate passed one slightly different, and then when they actually did the written recording in the official archives, it is slightly different yet. So for which, and the words are all the same, but the capitalizations and where the comma versus semicolon are things that you hear come up in debates if you listen to some lawyers speak about which one, what does a comma mean versus a semicolon and those things. So the fun of that, right? Second Amendment of the Constitution, and most of you know this, although I won't say for sure, as the school education on constitutional stuff seems to be lagging more and more and more all the time. Second Amendment to the United States Constitution is part of the United States Bill of Rights. It protects the right to keep and bear arms. It was adopted in, does anybody know? What year? 1791, December 15th, 1791, along with the rest of the Bill of Rights. So where did this come from? Where did we come up with the idea of having a Bill of Rights, and even more specifically this right to keep and bear arms? Well, actually, the right to keep and bear arms predates the actual Bill of Rights and was based partially on the right to bear arms in English common law, which was influenced by the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This right was considered in that point what was called an auxiliary right, which meant that it supported what was a natural right. The natural right being self-defense. And if we had the right for self-defense, or resistance to oppression, and a civic duty to act in concert in the defense of the state, and the state in this case meant us and our neighbors and the people around us, that by necessity you would have to be able to bear arms. You'd have to have some way of defending yourself, and that was the emphasis of this. This bill actually, interestingly, came about because the King of England at the time, who was Catholic, wanted to take all of the guns away from only the Protestants. The guns were officially illegal, but they were seizing only the guns and the weapons from the Protestants. Obviously that didn't go well, and ultimately that's basically where this came from. And what they said was that, you know, we can't take this away. People need to have the right to be able to defend themselves, and not to mention the fact that it was being done in a religious manner. The Catholics got to keep all their weapons and the Protestants didn't. So, early English settlers in America viewed the right to arms and/or the right to bear arms and the rights to state militias as important for a variety of reasons. And if you look them up, you'll find several that are listed as major reasons in different of the early charters and constitutions and early discussions back when our colonies were forming. The first was enabling the people to organize a militia system. The second, participating in law enforcement. Third, deterring tyrannical government. Next, repelling invasion. Next, suppressing insurrection. And finally, facilitating a natural right of self-defense. The first recorded U.S. Constitution to include this was the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1776 that asserted that, quote, the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. I'm giving you a lot of this background, and I'm going to now here in a moment give you a whole bunch of what the founders said about it, because I think there's a lot of argument about what did this mean, what was the intent. And often we get tied up into this idea of a living constitution, and I love the idea of a living constitution if you want to be able to do whatever you want. Because if it's not a fixed rule, then it doesn't mean anything. Laws don't really work that way. And the Constitution being the chief law, it can't just morph on its own. It's got an option for amending, but it can't morph on its own. So, the framers said the Bill of Rights sought to balance not just political power, but also military power between the people, the states, and the nation. Alexander Hamilton explained in 1788, quote, if circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little if at all inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. If you think about that one, boy, there's a little bit there, isn't there? Next, James Madison initially argued that the Bill of Rights wasn't even necessary because he thought the federal government could never raise a standing army powerful enough to overcome a militia in the first place. Federalist Noah Webster argued that an armed populace would have no trouble resisting the potential threat to liberty of a standing army. Anti-Federalists, however, advocated amending the Constitution with clearly defined and enumerated rights, providing more explicit constraints on the new government. Many anti-Federalists feared that the new federal government would choose to disarm the state militias. George Mason argued the importance of the militia and right to bear arms by reminding his compatriots of England's effort to, quote, disarm the people, that it was the best and most effectual way to enslave them by totally disusing and neglecting the militia, end quote. He also clarified that under prevailing practice, the militia included all people, rich and poor. Quote, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except a few public officers, because all were members of the militia, all enjoyed the right to individually bear arms to serve their end. James Monroe included, quote, the right to keep and bear arms, end quote, in a list of basic human rights, which he proposed to be added to the Constitution at the convention. Patrick Henry argued in the Virginia Ratification Convention in 1788 for the dual rights to arms and resistance to oppression. Quote, guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are inevitably ruined. James Madison in Federalist number 46 confidently contrasted the federal government of the United States and the European kingdoms of the time. He described the kingdoms as, quote, afraid to trust the people with arms, end quote. He assured his fellow citizens that they need never fear their government because of, quote, the advantage of being armed. Samuel Adams proposed that the Constitution, quote, be never construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms, or to prevent the people from petitioning in a peaceable and orderly manner the federal legislature, or a redress of their grievance, or to subject the people to unreasonable searches and seizures. Boy, aren't a lot of those in the news right now. All right, now I'm going to get a little more legal on you, because everybody says, what do the courts say about this? Because that's where things come in. So one of the first court cases was the U.S. versus, and I'm going to slaughter this, Cruikshank in 1875. And in that, the Supreme Court ruled that, quote, the right to bear arms is not granted by the Constitution, neither is it in any manner dependent upon the instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment needs no more than that it shall not be infringed by Congress, and has no other effect than to resist the power of the national government. I don't know if you followed that or not. What that basically meant was that the right to keep and bear arms wasn't the Constitution. The point of the constitutional amendment was to say the government's got no say, federal government has no say in this. I don't know whether that means much, but that was the point there. The United States versus Miller, a little more recent, in 1939, the Supreme Court ruled that the amendment, quote, protects arms that had a reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. This ruling has been used a lot to basically throw a lot of ambiguity in. So what weapons are necessary for a well-regulated militia? Well, I would say now that our National Guards have jets and stuff, I guess, does that imply we could have jets, or does that mean that you can only have guns that you would use if you were a soldier in the militia? You know, I guess, do we need bayonets? I mean, you start running into these, what does that mean? And there's a lot of ambiguity. So later on, there were more cases that helped clarify that. And the Heller case, who's heard of the Heller case in 2008? I imagine a few of you heard that in the news. The Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment, quote, codified a pre-existing right, and that it, quote, protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia, and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home, end quote. But it also stated that, quote, the right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. They also clarify that many long-standing prohibitions and restrictions on firearms possessions listed by the court are consistent with the Second Amendment. So basically, this is the first case where it came out clearly that you could have prohibitions on the rights to bear arms. Of course, that left more ambiguity and more questions for what can those be. Then you end up with McDonald versus Chicago in 2010, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment limits state and local governments to the same extent that it limits the federal government. And one last thing on restrictions, because I think with the reality of a right, there's a responsibility. I think most of us in here agree with that, and that's a big part of why we're here. So there was a case with Robertson versus Baldwin in 1897, and this one probably has the best issue here with what the states can do or not do. And if I remember right when I was reading this one was one where a guy had a sawed-off shotgun and he transported it from, I think it was Oklahoma to Arkansas. And so that was transporting across state lines an illegal gun because it was sawed off and it wasn't supposed to be, or something like that. It had to be 18 inches and it was 17 or something. I remember the exact details of it. But anyway, it said this: the law is perfectly well settled. Isn't that an interesting comment? It's perfectly well settled that the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, commonly known as the Bill of Rights, were not intended to lay down any novel principles of government, but simply to embody certain guarantees and immunities which we had inherited from our English ancestors, and which had, from time immemorial, been subject to certain well-recognized exceptions arising from the necessities of the case. In incorporating these principles into the fundamental law, there was no intention of disregarding the exceptions which continued to be recognized as if they had been formally expressed. Thus, the freedom of speech and of the press does not permit the publication of libels, blasphemous, or indecent articles, or other publications injurious to public morals or private reputation. The rights of the people to keep and bear arms is not infringed by law prohibiting the carrying of concealed weapons. So that brings us to where I think we're ready to go relatively new next. So long story short, the Constitution has been pretty well clarified at this point by the courts. The militia was everybody, not a formed army, not a state-formed army. It was felt to be everybody, that everybody had the rights to do that. And that was important, and that went back long before just our Constitution. This was felt to be a right that was necessitated by our own rights to defend ourselves. And defending ourselves and our property and our neighbors was felt to be an individual responsibility. And yes, we have fine police officers here. We've got them scattered throughout the area. And we all know that the unfortunate reality that I'm sure they'll tell us is that they can't be everywhere at once. I don't think you can be anyway yet, guys. Sometimes I think our government is trying to be everywhere at once with some of the things they're doing. But the reality is they rely on us as citizens to be responsible, to make right choices for ourselves. And that's not only not getting ourselves into positions where we can get in trouble, but also being able to help take care of ourselves, defend our homes in a safe, effective manner. Because the truth is, if somebody's going to break in, going to steal from you, somebody's coming after you, unless you happen to be standing next to the sheriff, he's not going to be there to defend you very quickly. He moves pretty quick, but not that quick. So, that's right. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our MC and let him take it from there.